Welcome everyone. Today is our second webinar organized by Pusat Sejarah Rakyat. I'm Rusaslina Idrus. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start, I just wanted to make a few logistical notes in case you're not familiar with this platform, Zoom. So we've asked everyone to be on mute while we're in this session. But I like to invite at the beginning of this webinar, because we're in this world where we're talking to these black squares and into the void of our laptop. I like to invite all of you, if you feel comfortable to, at the beginning of this introduction, to turn on your video so that we can see each other, wave and say hi, some familiar faces. And you can see everyone by clicking on the top right corner where it says gallery view. So you'll get that grid. Oh, lovely. You see like some familiar faces. Hi, everyone. So great to see you this evening. Yeah, a lot of familiar faces from many different places. So it's very lovely to see everyone. So thank you again for joining us. We will be recording this session. So if anyone are not able to join or not able to stay till the end, we will have it recorded and we'll share the recording. I would like to if you would like also, there's a chat box at the bottom. You can introduce yourself, you can write your name, your interest in people's history in the chat box, just so that even though, there's how many people now? There's about 70 people here. It's still nice to be able to know who's around and, and get to know. And I think it's a nice way also for the speakers to have a sense who's in the audience, right? It's a kind of a different feel because we can't have these like small chit chats before the seminar starts. So we have it on the chat room. So feel free to introduce yourself and sort of your interest in people's history. So our first webinar, we explored the question, apa itu sejarah rakyat? What is people's history? And this lecture was delivered by Professor Syed Hussein Ali with a commentary by Professor Jomo Sundaram. So video recording can be found on the PSR YouTube channel, and I will put the link as well in the chat box. And you can follow on that to watch the first webinar. So today's lecture continues our exploration of people's history by focusing on the concept of history from below. How can people's history from below be conceptualized, and how can it be documented? How can such a concept and practice of history be applied to the making of Malaysian history? So we have with us our speaker, Professor Diana Wong. Diana Wong is a board member of Pusat Sejarah Rakyat and was engaged in a PSR project to develop a methodology for the exploration and documentation of a history from below on the basis of personal, shared, and collective memory. Her academic training is in the sociology of development, while her research interest has been in the field of migration and religion. Currently, she is the Dean of Graduate School at the New Era University College in Kajang. We have with us, following Professor Diana, commentator, Dr. Ying Xin, who is coming to us all the way from Australia. I know it's kind of late there now. Ying Xin is a postdoctoral fellow at the Malaysia Institute at the Australian National University. And she is also a lecturer at ANU's School of Culture, History, and Language. She received a PhD in literature from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and she is interested in Southeast Asian history and literature. Her current research project looks at the cultural history of the Sinophone Chinese community in the making of Malaya during the Cold War through literature. She is the translator of Singapore writer Alfian Saad's short stories collection called The Malay Sketches, and she translated it into Chinese, and I believe that just came out. All right, people are still joining us, which I probably should have waited a little bit, but I think we have the majority of people here. Let me then give the floor to Professor Diana Wong. Go for it. Diana, you have to unmute.
Unmute.
Okay, I think you're there. Good. Yes, yes.
Let me begin. Thank you, Lynn. Good evening, everybody. Let me begin by making two confessions. The first is that I hate Zoom. I'm a Zoom hater. I never tune into webinars. I never do webinars. The reason being that, you begin with technical mishaps like, how do I unmute? And you end with technical mishaps like, where's the PPT that I spent hours preparing and it's not showing? So I hate Zoom, but I guess it's what people say, it's a so-called new normal, and old dinosaurs have to learn new tricks. I'll try my best. I have another confession to make before I begin the lecture this evening, and that is that I'm not a historian. I'm supposed to talk tonight about what is history from below, but I'm not a professional historian. But I imagine that most of you who have joined us tonight are also not professional historians. I think what we probably share is an interest in history and the realization that history matters, and in particular, Malaysian history matters, at least for us. That's the point at which I will begin. History matters, but what kind of history matters? Many of you would have listened into our first PSR webinar, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, where Professor Said Hussein and Professor Jomo spoke about the 3 kinds of history that we at Pusat Sejarah Rakyat want to think in terms of. I'll just give a very brief recapitulation here because they went into it in quite detail. There's first the official history. That's the kind of history we're taught in school, textbook history. The history that serves the state, legitimizes the nation, UMNO history. There's a second type of history that we think about, alternative history. That's the attempt to recover the names and voices of those who also fought for the nation, but who are not mentioned in our school textbooks. I think many of you may know of the book that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, wrote, and which appeared in 1999. It was his Memoirs, a 3-volume, I think it was 3 volumes or something like that. The Memoirs of Lee Kuan Yew. And he called it the Singapore Story. Story of Singapore was a story of Lee Kuan Yew, the official story, the official history. And I think it was that which motivated, which encouraged the rise of alternative history in Singapore and in Malaysia in subsequent to that other people wanted to tell their stories as well, and began to tell their stories. That the Singapore story was not just the Lee Kuan Yew story. One of the stories which had to be told, and which was then told, was told by Dr. Sukai, who was one of the founders of Pusat Sejarah Rakyat in Malaysia. But that would be alternative history. those, and Syed Hussein Ali writes about this alternative history in his book, Sejarah Rakyat Malaysia, and spoke about it at our first webinar. Now, there's a third type of history that we think is important, that was mentioned by Syed Hussein as well. We call it people's history or history from below. Syed and Jomo mentioned it in last webinar, but didn't elaborate too much on it. And that's what I would like to do today. What exactly would be a people's history or history from below? As usual, I would like to make 3 points, 3 items. Now, I haven't prepared a PPT in the expectation that there would be a technical problem with it, but it's easy enough to remember 3 points with regard to the question of people's history or history from below. First would be the concept, practice, and paradigm are the 3 issues that I would like to deal with in the rest of my talk. Okay, let's begin with the concept. People's history, history from below, people's history from below. I think any one of you who is familiar with the literature, or even if you're not familiar with the literature, can imagine that these concepts, these terms mean different things to different people.
Going into not just history, what they call it.
Sorry. Should I continue, or was that a question?
You can continue.
Okay. Okay. I was saying that the terms people's history or history from below means different things to different peoples, to different people. I think the concept of people's history is most often associated with the name of Howard Zinn, who wrote the book in 1980, a highly influential book, People's History of the United States, where he tried to write an alternative history of the United States, not just a story of George Washington and whoever they were, Thomas Jefferson and so on, but the story of the slaves who were brought over to the US, etc. Then the concept of history from below is most closely associated with the name of E.P. Thompson, the English historian, who wrote the book published in 1963, very influential book as well, called The Making of the English Working Class. Since then, other practitioners, other names, other perspectives, other frameworks have been developed, which can also, or which would also fall under the concept of people's history or history from below. But what I want to point out to, what I would want to try to distillate is, out of all this, there is, I think, a key conceptual core to the idea of a history from below. And that is that it, well, basically, it is a reaction, or it rejects the notion of a history from above. A history of above, from above, which maybe you could say could be characterized in at least 2 ways. One, this has been very much, pretty much, this history of dates and facts and events, the official history, has been very much actually a history without people. At the same time, it's actually relegated people to be people without history. In that kind of official history, a lot of people, many people have been conceptualized as being without history. We know the term, peoples without history. If you don't, so I think what we could say with respect to people's history, it's a very simple formulation, but maybe powerful nonetheless. A people's history puts people first, as against a history without people and a history that would make people, define people as without history. Basically, what this means for a history from below is that the subjects of history are not just the great men and the evil women of court struggles and power struggles. The subjects of history are ordinary people. People, their experiences, their perspectives, the perspectives and experiences of ordinary people. And in putting people first, in making the subjects of history, the ordinary people or the common people, the key issue, key theoretical issue, as well as practical issue, is that of agency. In Thompson's book on the making of the English working class, one of the very pregnant phrases or formulations that he uses is that the working class made itself as much as it was made. I think that is probably the basic, the most fundamental perspective in a history from below. That you see people, that people are seen not just as victims of history, objects of history, but also agents of history, makers of history. Basically, when this kind of perspective was introduced into the study of history, it resulted in, I think, two processes, two outcomes. One was the scope of history was enlarged. So, you get not just kings and princes and princess and Cinderellas, but ordinary people and their everyday lives. The scope of history was enlarged. And secondly, the depth of history was extended, was deepened, meaning we went beyond merely looking at political narratives, but went into the exploration of experiences, everyday life experiences, and the perspectives which were generated by these everyday life experiences, the structures of everyday life, and which were then crystallized in the experience of traumatic collective experiences, shared traumatic collective experiences. That's, Lynn mentioned the terms personal, shared, collective experiences and memories became part of the subject of history as well. This meant that, well, maybe when I say the scope of history, not just kings and princes and Cinderellas, and then not just, it went beyond that to the working class, the laboring class, but not just that as well. We began to see that there was a history of women, of different types of women. There was a history of places. There were history of communities which had not been studied, which had not been seen before. under the rubric of history from below, you would study events, not just everyday events, but also major collective events like May 13th. You could study a lot more things than just the political narrative. So that's extending the scope of history. And extending the depth of history. I could say a lot more about, I suppose, more about the concept of history, but I think it's fundamentally a very basic idea, a simple idea, but clear enough, I think. Let me go on to the next point then, the practice of history. I think it was in the expansion of the scope and the depth of history that the question of practice arose again, where we just had to record a political narrative. You could go to the archives to do that, but not if you're looking at the lives of ordinary people. So of course, oral history became important. But let me be, so with respect to practice or methodology, again, I want to make 2 points, or raise 2 issues. I want to talk about oral history and the question of memory. And I want to talk about voice and the question of context. But before I do so, I want to make the point that practice for the history from below is not just about oral history. Records, archival records, newspaper accounts, all the other source materials of, you see, one of the reasons why I hate Zoom is because technical mishaps happen, and my iPad, my iPhone, on which my notes are written, is now running out of battery. So my apologies. Let me go back to the question of practice. I was saying that that a history from below has required the experimentation, the development of new methodologies, the most important methodology being that of oral history. But as I said, it does not mean that history from below can only or should only be done with oral history. You know, I've been doing, my current research is in the local history of a small town in Malaysia called Kapok, which is now no longer a small town. Its history goes back 100 years to the 1870s. And I've been doing oral history interviews with men and women who are in their late 70s. They're about the oldest people that I can get my hands on. And their memory only goes back to the Japanese occupation and thereafter. Everything before that is not available through the method of oral history. So oral history should not be equated with a perspective, with a history from below perspective, but it is an extremely important tool for the history, for writing a history from below. This oral history, of course, is closely related to the question of memory. And I think the point that I want to make here is that memory, of course, is deceptive. An oral history interview is not like just, the great thing about oral history interview today is that you can record it, but memory is not like a recorder. So I think what is important for an oral history interviews is not just the question of factual information. One has to be very careful indeed of the kind of factual information that one gets in an oral history interview. What is important in an oral history interview is not only facts, perhaps even more than that, it is meaning, the meaning of the experience, the meaning of that period for the person, for the subject involved. There's a lot of discussion on that. We could go into that later. But I think the second issue I said I wanted to talk about, to raise with respect to practice, is of course the question of voice. With oral history, with the tool of oral history, we can give voice to those who have been voiceless before. But I think it's not just a matter of the other thing about is, cats insist on going in front of the laptop or a screen. The advantage of the oral history, as a tool, is that it allows us to give voice to those who have very often been voiceless and marginalized. But I think the important thing is to be able to put voice into context. Voice alone, documentation alone is not enough. There has to be the analytical step of putting voice into context, into a larger context. And that's actually what we tried to do. And I think it was really fascinating, the kind of insights that provided in the project that Lynn mentioned, which we conducted at Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, where we had people talking about doing oral history interviews, and getting, with the grandmothers, for example, grandmother stories, migration stories, stories of not a trade union dispute, but story from the daughter of a trade unionist who was brought along to all these trade union meetings, and how she experienced the labor disputes as a child, as a teenager. So these kinds of stories were really fascinating when together we could relate these individuals, these personal voices, personal stories, to the national context or to the shared context. We had a story on the one hand of an old Chinese man from Penang, who had fought for the Kuomintang, and then was a member of the urban underground of the MCP in the 1940s. On the other hand, a story of a Malay police, I think he was an army officer or police, he joined the police and went into the jungle. And he talks about the first time he was actually caught in an ambush. And we had these two people, these two stories related to each other at a session. And we tried to understand them. It was a wonderful way of seeing the context of the emergency and what it meant to different peoples in different locations, different situations. So when we talk about practice, we have to think in terms of practice and oral history. I think what is important is the issue of memory and meaning, and voice and context. Okay, we've gone through 2 points which I wanted to make in today's talk. One was the concept of history from below. The second was the practice of history from below. I come to the final point I want to make, and I think my time is almost up, so I won't say very much. The third point I want to make is paradigm. I think the history from below, the promise of the history from below, lies more than in the enlargement of scope, an extension of depth, more than in the development of a new methodology. A history from below can also mean a change in paradigm, a different framework for looking at our own national history. See, the question for us is how to tell the story of the making of Malaysia. What kind of history do we need to tell the Malaysian story? Yes, we can tell it in terms of a political narrative, the fight for independence, etc. We can tell it, the Malaysian story, in terms of a dominant class, a dominant race, a dominant ideology. But the fact of the matter is that Malaysia is too diverse, too plural. There have been too many interactions, too many border crossings, too many intersections. Such wealth of life, such richness of detail, so many stories that went into the making of Malaysia. So that the story of the making of Malaysia can probably best be told from a history from below perspective, by giving voice and meaning and context to the personal, shared, and collective experiences and memories that we all have. You know, when I talk to young people today in Malaysia, many of them have the sense that we don't have a history. They don't have a sense of personal history. They don't have a sense of Malaysian history. In fact, Mariam, who's our technical manager today, said, Mariam, I presume you still belong to the category of young people. She said, I feel like I'm a consumer of history. I think that's probably quite apt. Because actually, with the official type of history, we are just relegated to the position of consumers of history. I think, let me end by saying, the paradigm shift that a history from below perspective or approach to our national history would entail would be a shift from seeing the people, that is ourselves, as not as consumers of history, but rather as producers of history. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And actually, we have a lot of fans for your cats as well here.
Sorry about that.
Very much welcome. Thank you, Diana. And you know, if I said before, you really don't even need your notes. You already have so much to share, and in giving us a lot of food for thought in terms of thinking of history from below, sort of thinking about it in terms of its concept, its practice, and also, you know, what can it contribute to our understanding of the history of Malaysia. And so you gave some examples of that. Now I'm going to go to invite Dr. Ying Xin, and Ying Xin actually going to take this further and sort of give us some examples of projects of history from below, and also her own work and commentary on this. Ying Xin will be sharing her screen, so feel free to also, when she shares the screen, you can click on the green button on the right. There's an option to view side by side. That's sort of probably a comfortable viewing mode where you can see a screen on one side and the speaker on the other. So without further ado, Ying Xin, I give you the floor. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you. Thanks, Diana, for the really insightful talk. But I will be sharing screen only later, so not now. It's really my true honor and to be here to give some thoughts on Diana's presentation. It is also a very stressful commentaries, because Diana is in such an interdisciplinary sociologist whom I really admire, and the way that she put her thoughts into very clear, structured, organized presentation, which is also what I really envy about, because I have problems following my own points in my presentations. So well, I really like Diana's works on migration, refugees, memory studies, etc. in Malaysia and Singapore, and as myself, as someone who has been trained in literary studies, I always envy, social scientists who have field work experiences, who often go to the ground and talk to the people, unlike us who focus more on textual analysis, who we mainly deal with books, like magazines, published works. And for some, although not many, who also look into archival materials. So in short, we mainly deal with documented or written materials. So it seems so boring, and this is what oral historians try to dispute. The written materials supersede oral history, and so what is more, literary researcher often deal not with facts, but instead we deal with fictions. So, so historians usually questions the reliability of literary works as testimony to history. But I think rather interestingly, when ordinary people want to understand a historical period or an event, not many will actually look for history books. But instead they will maybe read novels, stories. So let's say if people would read, maybe not today, Charles Dickens to understand French Revolution, or read Arundhati Roy's novel to understand contemporary India, or in the case of Malaysia, maybe people today tend to read Tan Tuan Eng's novels to understand Japanese occupation. So I think we also cannot underestimate the power of fiction in creating the kind of historical imagination for ordinary people. So, but anyway, as you can see, I might be the least suitable person to talk about history today to all of you. So when I received the invitation, I was a bit hesitant because there are many historians out there who could talk more specifically about the field. But Lynn told me that Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, it's making a case that history making is not just for historians, which I totally agree with. And because I also believe that historical discussions are for everyone who wants to participate in, like what Diana has mentioned. And so the discussion should not be exclusive to only the historians. And I also believe that disciplinary boundaries are meant to be traversed, but not to limit our imagination and creativity. So it would be wonderful if more and more literary scholars can pay attention to archival materials, to oral history or field work, and there will be even more wonderful if social scientists and historians can also use literary works as sources. I think more importantly, we need more non-scholars and non-elites to participate in the history-making process, which is the focus on the webinar today. So I only have 10 minutes, and right now I want to share my screen on some case examples that I can think of what kind of, because Diana has given us a wonderful lecture about what is oral history, and I thought that many of us might be interested to know and to discuss about what kind of oral history projects that has been done in Malaysia. So I would like to maybe share a few works that I'm familiar with and I think are interesting. Of course, there must be more that I don't manage to cover them all here. So these are mostly in book form. Let me try to share my screen. Yeah, can you all see my screen now? Yeah, so yes, great. So the first one is Life as the River Flows, Women in the Malayan Anti-Colonial Struggle. So it is published in 3 language versions, so Chinese, Malay, and English. It's quite a remarkable book that collects. It's published by Gerak Budaya. So it is a remarkable book that collects 16 real-life stories of the Malayan communist women who fought the anti-British war. So this is the term from the communist side. So from the government's perspective, of course, it's the communist insurgency during the Malayan emergency. So the author went to the peace villages in the southern Thailand. So she lived with these women and collected their accounts of the struggles. So I think the book is considered one of the first to focus on the women in the Communist Party, the communist women's lives, given that neither at the national level nor within the Communist Party itself, that the narratives from the women fighters have been largely neglected. So Agnes Ku's works is a good testimony of their lives in the jungle. How do they live in armed struggles in the jungle for these women, and it also gives voice to these women on their thoughts on the struggle that they have chosen to take on, and also their relationships with their male counterparts. So I think these are really interesting stories that we all have to know about the 16 Malayan women. And interestingly, the Malay version is banned a few years ago, but not the English and Chinese version. Yeah, the other one that I want to show is this Chinese book, second one. It's an oral history of a historical event, the May 13 racial riot. So it's called Reborn on the Wound, Personal Oral Narrative of the May 13. So one of the editors is here with us today. So the Chinese language version is published this year, and we anticipate the English version will come out hopefully next year. So this group of 4 young women form an oral history group to collect 19 stories from eyewitnesses and family of the May 13 victims. So they interview the family members who visited the mass grave of May 13 victims in Sungai Buloh, and also from other sources as well. So as we all know, the May 13 documents are yet to be declassified in the National Archive. So the truth of May 13 remained obscured. So there are also other books that they try to offer alternative perspective of the history, but actually not a single book deals with how this tragedy is really felt and witnessed at the personal or individual level. So these stories, although only 19 of them, fill the important gap of how is the tragedy being felt personally. So I think one really has to be mentally prepared before reading these tragic stories. I received the book actually some months ago, but I can only read it very, very slowly because emotionally it's really hard to take when you read these real stories about the family members who lost their beloved ones in the May 13th and the killings that happened on their lives. So, and the third one I would like to share, it's not a collection of oral histories like the previous two, but it is a comprehensive account of community history, like what Diana's mentioned, Kepong history, etc. So this is on Parit Jawa, a community in a Chinese community in Imoa. So this book, it drew largely from oral history of the local villages. So the book is actually commissioned by a local Chinese clan association in Moa, and two scholars conducted archival research and oral history to kind of piece together the history of the community in Parit Jawa. So there are chapters on local temples, local schools, festivals, different villages, and how are the relationship, the dialect groups of different villages, and also some association, etc. And interestingly, it also included some old villages, memories of racial clashes that happened immediately after the war in the area, because immediately post-war period in between Batu Pahat and Moa, there were severe racial clashes that we can read from Chabang Keng's book, Red Star Over Malaya. But these scholars or historians, they collect the personal memory of the villager who lived through the period, and some are already 80 or 90 who can still remember what happened during that time. Where did it hide from the other race? Yeah, so these are interesting works that I'm familiar with, and I would like to share with you. Of course, these are only oral stories or histories in book form, but we have, of course, a lot of other mediums that collect oral history. And what we might be familiar with could be the documentaries that use oral histories as sources. So Fahmi Reza's works, Amir Muhammad's works, and also a young director, Jun Eng's works on her village, a new village. So, and also some films from Freedom Film Festivals as well. So Freedom Film Network that they So they have put a lot of Malaysian documentaries online for free at this webpage, and you can see, although some are not really focused on oral histories, but they are also try to document the individual memories and narratives on a certain event or history or a community. So I think these are interesting works that I want to share. So for those interested in the oral history programs or project in Malaysia that has been conducted at the national level or institutional level, for example, the universities or the Akib Negara, etc. There's one interesting essays written by USN history professor Mahani Musa in her article called Reconstructing the Past Through Oral History. So she gave us some development of oral history program in Malaysia as compared to Singapore. Singapore National Archive has really put in a lot of efforts to collect oral histories from ordinary people, from politicians, educationists, and a lot of local Singaporeans. So they've done more than 4,000 oral history interviews and put up on their website. So this is really huge effort. So I would stop share. So the last point I want to make, maybe it's is oral history for what purpose? So I think oral history, it's not just for research purpose, but it kind of serves its parts for many other purpose. So it could be as big, the purpose could be as big as, you know, like rewriting national history, but it can also be at a personal level, like recognizing your own family history by interviewing your grandpa or grandmother. Yeah, my grandpa passed away this year at the age of 95. I really regretted for not recording his stories as early as possible. So, or oral history can also help us deal with historical trauma by telling the story to others or sharing the memories in what Diana mentioned in this kind of shared collective experience atmosphere. So it would help us heal the wound as well. So, or oral history can also be incorporated into the creative works of filmmakers, artists, writers, etc. So I think for the later part, in the forms of documentary, artworks, exhibitions, literary works, etc., can help disseminate the oral history to a wider audience, which would definitely speak to many who don't read history books. It can really help carry out the message to the wider audience. Yeah, I think I would stop here and really look forward to have more discussion with you all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ying Xin. That was great, and in a way, it's a good also introduction to just a couple of the examples that you gave. We'll be actually hosting Fahmi Reza next month, and also Hyung Hong is also scheduled for January. You know, we're starting the Pusat Sejarah Rakyat webinars with sort of more foundational conversations about what is oral history and the concept of history from below. And then further on, we'll be looking at in different examples, as you have presented as well, how oral history, the oral history project is taken on, and in particular ones that are trying to provide another slice or another view of the history of Malaysia. Thank you so much. So we have some questions here. We'll start with Hyung Hong, who had, you can unmute Hyung Hong and ask, and Hyung Hong's work was one of the ones that was mentioned earlier. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Lynn. Thank you. Yeah, I have a question, or maybe two. The first is about, and thanks Diana and Ying Xin both for a very wonderful, fascinating presentation. I really learned a lot and enjoyed a lot. Yeah, and my question is, I remember having this conversation with some people before as well. Like, Diana has already mentioned that oral history is mostly used for probably like people who are really from below, but there are also like for example, PSR website also has kept some records of oral history with people who are actually literate, including like people who can actually write, who can read and write, and then and they can actually write their memoir, right? So my question is, what are your thoughts on the differences between a person probably like, okay, maybe Dr. Paul Sukai writing his own memoir or autobiography with, you know, someone having conducting oral history with him? What are your thoughts on this? You know, the differences between these two methods. Thank you.
I'm sure Ying Xin has something to say to that. But can I try a quick response? Yeah. Well, I think first of all, oral history is not just used for doing interviews with those from below. I think oral history as a method, as a tool, can be used and is used to interview people from above. Say, like you say, for example, someone like Po Sukai. Although generally, as you say, the literate would tend to write memoirs, and we think that It is the non-literate who would be interviewed orally. Before I go into that specifically, I think I also want to make a distinction between oral history as a method and history from below as a perspective. That they're not the same, but okay. Yeah, what would be, I've actually wondered whether, what it would be like to interview Dr. Po Suu Kai after having read his memoir. I think, well, a lot of it would be contextual, but there are processes, there's some things that you would only sometimes tell somebody in a conversation to someone else. It's in communication that sometimes thoughts coalesce. Writing a memoir can reveal more, it can sometimes reveal less. So I think the point is, here again, I would make the distinction between facts and meaning. The question is, what kind of meaning would a writer in writing a memoir, in the process of writing, what kind of meaning would he ascribe to his life? As compared to when you are in conversation with somebody, with another person, with another, you would also be trying to justify, to ascribe some kind of legitimacy of meaning to your life. Whether there would be a difference, I assume there could be, not necessarily so. But yeah, why did you ask that question? Why do you think it was important? It would be important.
I actually had no clue before this, but then, thanks for your response. I think, it says a lot about, when you are responding to questions in an interview, in some communication, what you are likely to reveal could be very different when you are writing, because writing, the consciousness of writing and is different from when you're facing someone, I guess so. Just like when the interview is recorded or unrecorded, that sometimes that also can make some difference. Yeah, people respond, because these are also context, but it's about the context of when or where you are revealing yourself and who you are revealing to. So I suppose that makes sense to me. Yeah. Before this, I haven't really had clear thoughts about it. That's why I thought that it would be good to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Yeah.
Diana, you have anything else to add, or Ying Xin, to that question?
Yeah, I don't think I thought Hyung Hong was asking whether how do we interview someone who can write and someone who cannot write for themselves. So because we kind of lost the connection just now, so maybe I got the question wrong. So you're actually not asking about how do we interview people who can write and cannot write, right?
No. It's not about interviewing who can write or cannot write, but rather when a person is interviewed. I mean, the oral history of the same person and the biography or memoir of the same person. Yeah, what are the differences? Yeah.
Maybe I don't have much thought about that. Yeah, Diana, you want to add something?
No, it's okay.
Okay, we might come back to that, I think, in a different question. Valerie Mashman has asked, I'm writing oral histories from a longhouse about peacemaking before and after in Sarawak. Question for Diana, you don't mention decolonization, and I wonder if it's deliberate.
Right, well, I didn't, you're quite right. I didn't mention decolonization, but I didn't mention a lot of other political context as well. I think the work that you would do I was thinking of in terms of the relationship, as I said, between voice and context. Decolonization would be a context. The kind of stories that you hear in a longhouse would have to be related, can be related to the process of decolonization. In fact, they acquire, of course, they have individual subjective meaning, but they would acquire collective meaning in the context of decolonization. And I think that's precisely the kind of work that, to some degree, academics can do. I mean, we felt in our project that that was one of the roles that we could play in getting people to tell their stories, but in being in trying to link these stories to the larger political context. That context, that larger political context could be decolonization, that larger political context could be the Cold War, could be anything. Yeah. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yeah, if I may maybe interject here, it would seem that the People's History Project is also can be considered a decolonizing project, because we're providing different sources and different viewpoints of history, sort of challenging sort of this mainstream history, which is either settler history or colonizer history, and so history of the dominant, basically. And so in a way, the People's History Project, if you would agree, is also a form of a decolonizing project. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I will leave that there. And I also just wanted to point out, Lillian Tong had shared her own work, and others, if you like to, you can also share the kind of projects that you're involved in or other resources that you think people would be interested in. Lillian Tong writes, I just finished compiling Penang Baba Nyonya stories from various and we'll be publishing Once Upon a Kajang in December. Interesting to come across the Malaysian athlete Art China Games, winning the gold for pole vault hurdles, and the one who won for chess in the All England has a chess move named after him. Okay, I'm Lillian Tong, Museum Director of Penang Peranakan Mansion and President of the Penang Baba Nyonya Association. So thank you, Lillian, for sharing that, and others, if you'd like to share your projects, you can do so in this chat box. The next question is from Katrina. How does human rights documentation, cases or reports fit within the scope of history from below, if at all? And how or how can those spaces of interaction can also be a history recording processes? Would you like to take that, Diana?
You want to start? Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think that goes to to the heart of what can be done with it, or what has to be done with the history from below perspective, because human rights violations are very often, most often, committed against those who are powerless, marginalized, unable to defend themselves, illiterate. I mean, a lot of human rights violations are not just against individuals. We find a lot of that. If we want, in an alternative history perspective, you're going to come across so much human rights violations and issues. But in writing collective histories of peoples who have been taken to be without a history, marginalized communities, human rights violations come up. It's a central issue. I think that's one reason, that one of the things which motivates us to talk, to work from a history from below perspective, the injustice that you see all the time when history is the history of the powerful, the history of the winners, the history the history of the court that justifies the state and, of course, state power. Yes, so I would agree with you entirely.
Yeah, I also agree. And I think human rights documentation is very clearly a history from below, but not all history from below are about human rights violation, and not all history from below projects that could possibly kind of have this very clear message or political message to convey. I think documentary has this very clear political message that the directors want to convey. So history, like what Freedom Film was showing, all this documentaries, these are about human rights. But I think history from below, it's also it also meant a lot at the personal levels as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that we want to champion human rights or something. So it could be about family history that has been forgotten, about tracing your own family history that's unknown to you, etc. And especially, I think it's important for history from below. One aspect of history from below is to kind of, how do you engage the interviewees, the people that you want to interview? Did you want to hear about their stories? Because I think from a lot of cases, a lot of this, ordinary folks, people, they don't think their stories are worth to be recorded. So when you ask your father or grandpa, grandmother, oh, these are, just some family stories or something, why would you want to document? Why would you want to write them down? So I think the important part is, how do we put their voices into proper context, to borrow Diana's words? We try to give them voices to speak up, but how do we put their stories into proper context? If you interview maybe just a mother, maybe I can give an example. I help a social historian to conduct some interviews on industrial workers in Singapore in the 70s. It just happened that one of the interviewees is my father, and he has been. I know his story all along, and I know that he worked in Singapore, during the 70s, and as a worker, construction workers as well. But I never thought that I would want to record his story. And then this project, a friend of mine told me about the project that he has been working on, and I say, my father is one of them. And so I was asked to interview my own father, although there are also other difficult ethical issues involving daughter and father relationship, that he won't say something just to me. He won't. Maybe he would speak to other interviewer, but just not me, about certain things that as a father he doesn't want to share. Well, I just want to point out that it's important to kind of recognize the significance of a person's life story, and how just try to put them into context. Yeah.
I think
can I say something to Lynn? Oh,
yes, please, Dan.
But if there's some more questions, I think we should take questions, really. But maybe just very quickly, can I add something to what Ying just said? It's a response I get. I've gotten very, very often when you ask somebody to tell their story, and they say, "Why me? I mean, I'm just an ordinary person. I didn't do anything. I'm not one of these great men." But that's precisely why I think we ought to pay more attention to the conceptualization of a history from below, a more foundational conceptualization of a history from below. it's, I thought, you know, I'm really impressed by the number of, by the presentation you made, Yin, when you showed how many, you know, serious work being published based on oral history. And then we have actually in all over the country, many different projects working, oral history projects. But the thing is, I think there is still the attitude, oh, these are only oral history projects. These are just ordinary people. I mean, the people think so themselves, right? So you get this attitude, these are only oral history projects, and we're not linked together. They remain individual histories at the individual level or community level or event level. That I think we need to provide a framework, maybe even a movement, a context within which these these small projects, these little stories, I used to call them Kajang Putih stories. They're actually Kajang Putih stories. I grew up in a generation when Kajang Putih was still an important part of our daily life. It was a treat. They are Kajang Putih stories, but Kajang Putih stories are important if we give them a context, if we give them the recognition that history from below is not just a third rank, third rung, third rate history as compared to the real history, the official history, the kind that spends 20 years looking into the archives and digging out archival materials. We just go and take a microphone and talk to people. I think if we were able to provide that kind of context to the work that's being done in Malaysia, not just the context to voice, but the context to work that's being done in Malaysia, that could maybe be an important step toward rewriting the Malaysian story, or a Malaysian story. Sorry, Lynn.
No, that's a really important point that needed to be made, and I think it's one of this. One of our big lessons when we had the oral history workshop was sort of seeing these personal stories, where part of the workshop was participants went out to interview, you know, their grandmother, their aunties, their uncles, and then we came back and tried to tie it to the larger Malaysian history. Where did it fit, right? So I think this is sort of the project that Dinah is saying, how we need to not only just see these personal stories as, you know, the family history, but how family histories also relate to the larger, you know, national history, and how we all are participating and making the case that how we are all participants in history making, not just sort of, you know, the bapa, whatever, negara out there, but, you know, the individual makcik, pakcik, auntie, uncles are also very much part of the making of Malaysia. So I think it's a very important point that you made. I'm glad you spent that time talking about that. I'd like to go to a question here by Munira, where she asks, is it important to highlight systems of hierarchy, whether of race, gender, class, that are present in the below, or is it valuable in itself, just documenting stories that are not official histories? Dana, would you like to take this first?
I think that's an important question. And I think there's a danger that we romanticize a history from below, or we romanticize the people below. I mean, people below are as imperfect as people above. But the point is, and I think we have to recognize that, one criticism made of E.P. Thompson's book and his portrayal of the English working class is that he talks about how the English working class emerged out of a basis of solidarity and political consciousness and so on. And the criticism was that just as much as there was solidarity, there was competition. There was all sorts of nasty things going on. The popular mind is not pure and compassionate, not just pure and compassionate. I think the stories that were told about, that have been told about May 13th would show that there was violence, but there was goodness and kindness. There was care, there was concern, and there was solidarity, there was hatred, there was anger, there was resentment in the popular mind as well as in the elite mind. I think that's something that we have to be open to and to be honest about. The fact remains, however, that this that the voices have to be heard. And then they can, and only when they are heard can they enter into a dialogue with each other. I think that was important. That was for me one of the most moving events from our experiences from our oral history project, when we had this story about this elderly Chinese man from Penang on the one hand, and the story about a young Malay policeman on the other, and his experience of how his comrade, his fellow, the man in the team, just fell. And it was first, and it was the ability to bring these two stories together that made such, I think, that moved us so deeply. And I think if that is, I think, where a history from below can provide, and an oral history, what we've been talking about, can provide, well, it's a cliche, means of healing, at least the promise of healing. It may not be the case. It may, unearthing, I think that's a common fear, unearthing these stories may actually make the situation worse. It's a risk that we have to take, but it's something that we have to be honest about. That would be my position.
Ying Xin, you have anything to add to that?
Which, well, I totally agree with Dinah, and it's so nicely put. It's how should I put, of course, in terms of race, gender, and class, we know that there are marginalized community untold narrative that because of history from above, mainstream narrative that we haven't heard from history from below, that there is this political intention that we have to make them heard. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge there might be ugly truth about racial relations, about discrimination, about hatred, resentment, like what Diana has mentioned, especially on May 13th story. Yeah, so what this is actually also what I have been thinking about from my reading of a novel on May 13th, Hannah Alkalf, The Weight of the Sky, which is also a good, can say, testimony of May 13th riot itself. And I think because for all of these 50 years that we have been saying that we want May 13th stories to be told, we want the truth to be unearthed or something. And we also have this urge that we want to heal the wounds of racial resentments. But is that really possible if all the truth has been unearthed? And is it is it possible that we really can heal our wound? And I think what Hannah Alkalf tried to make a point in her novel is that we all have to accept that hatred, distrust happened in our daily life and in every racial community, and we just have to accept the fact. And it is actually not right to force all these narratives, all this May 13 narratives, force them into an episode of reconciliation. that we want people to reconcile. We want people to reconcile, but we haven't heard the stories yet. And it seems that we already have an objective that we want to reconcile. But I think actually the process tells much more about how do we manage to reconcile. So yeah, so for this, I really like what Diana has put it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really really great points that was raised, and it reminds me, when I think it was Tam Si Hao has a documentary about the Meta teen, which started as a personal narrative of her family, but it got the conversation going about Meta teen during the Freedom Film Festival. I think last year, right? And I remember people were asking, but what really happened? So, and I think the answer is that there's no like one truth, right? Because what these oral history and these projects of trying to get, stories out shows us that there's so many different experiences of this particular event, right? And we might never have like one truth, like there's no one truth of what really happened, right? Because there are so many different stories from different experiences, from different angles. And perhaps that's sort of the value of these kinds of oral history projects or history from below projects, is that it allows us to witness and listen to all these different stories. And as you're saying, we shouldn't like force this, like, okay, heal now. We all hurt before, just like heal, get over it. But actually, when I've been following a bit about the Canadian First Nation and their process of reconciliation, and I remember a speaker came and talked about this process and asked them, what was the process like? And he said one of the first things was just listening. So it was just listening to lots and lots and lots of stories and witnessing, all these different perspectives and stories. And perhaps that's sort of where we need to be at the moment, and listening. And, and it's great to have people like, Hyung Hong and Si Hao and all these other people who are sort of giving us an opportunity to listen and witness all these different stories and perspectives. So perhaps that's sort of a call for more of these kinds of, history from below for that objective. There's a question from Bun Kiaming. Kiaming, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you for organizing this. Thanks, Diana and Ying Xin, for your talk. Actually, my question could be more of a problem in a sense that I hear a lot about a lot of these oral history projects are they stem from a time where a lot of the speakers were silenced by the state. Times of great state violence, as it were. So, like the example of the Agnes Koo work. But I think what I wanted to raise is the issue of in the more contemporary period, in Malaysia, for example, let's say the pandemic period, there's a lot of stories or voices that cannot speak out. We know about it, like let's say if you want to gather in, data for oral history, let's say the question of like the Al Jazeera documentary that speaks, from the perspective of the undocumented, and also not just for the undocumented, but like, let's say Malaysians who suffer state violence from abuse of power by the police. Like every day, we hear about 600 people being arrested. We don't know how far these kind of experiences, meaning what I'm trying to suggest is that history is in the making, but it's very hard to speak in the contemporary moment because you may face state violence for speaking out. And so the question is, yeah, somehow oral history is something that is safer to be recorded, to be released, like a time capsule to be placed for unearthing in 20 years' time. Because to speak the truth now, to share what you think, your experience of perhaps, just to sharpen my argument, is like there's at least 40% Malaysians who do not use the My Sejahtera app, because they are afraid that, yeah, for one reason or another, the state can use the information to surveillance or whatnot. But the people who let's say, yeah, in their day-to-day life of facing the pandemic moment, they have this kind of consciousness not to easily just submit to so-called the grand narrative or the state policies. These voices are, it's hard to verbalize now, even like you want to say it on Twitter, on social media, that, oh yeah, I'm someone who believes that the state is actually encroaching into, but yeah, anyway, yeah, I hope that my question is more like a problem, you know, like, is it something, oral history is safe, it's kind of like a safety in comparison to being able to speak out in the contemporary moment. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kiaming. Would Diana or Ying Xin like to take that question?
Ying Xin, would you like to start first? And I have something to say to that, but
yeah, maybe I just
go ahead,
very quickly. Yeah, I think what Kiaming pointed out, it's a good question about time lag in oral history, about but I think actually history is about present, and why do we do oral history now but not 50 years ago? Why can't we do May 13 oral history at 1970 but now? So I think there is there must be some reasons behind it, and something needs time. And for example, for Agnes Khoo's story, the reason that the fact that she recorded this stories at the year of 2004 or 2007, I heard from someone that, you know, these same people, they won't be telling the same story now if you interview them. So so I think we couldn't, it's really hard to say that, you know, it's like a time capsule that, you know, history, we could really cover everything, and they told their story, and that belonged to their story in that particular period. But we also have to keep making sense of what happened right now, and what prompted us to record this story. So yeah, just some very scattered thoughts. But I think what you mentioned about the issue of time lag, it's important for us to think about. Diana, over to you.
Diana, would it be okay if I just ask another question which is very related to that? So you might be able to answer those. So one actually asked something very related. What do you think about the short stories shared and told by many youngsters and many ordinary citizens during say 1.0 and 2.0 demonstration? Though this is definitely not related to oral history that is discussed here. In my opinion, the value of those voices from below could be highly valuable 50 years from now. How do we capture history from now? So which is very much related in a way to what Kiaming was saying.
good question. Well, actually, Kiaming, I think that there is actually work done on migrants and refugees in Malaysia. I think that's the kind of work that you would say is not, it wouldn't fall under the rubric of oral history as such, but it's supposed to be what sociologists do, for example, in the course of normal field work. So the study of the contemporary, I think, it's not necessarily an issue of oral history as such. It's more it's related to the question of a history from below, or a perspective from below. What in the contemporary today in Malaysia, if you were a sociologist, if you were a social scientist, if you were a literary researcher, if you were a writer of fiction, what would you write about? What would you research? Would you go and would you research on the marginalized communities of today? Although, would you research on the Bersih movement? And in doing that research, would you, if you were writing about Bersih, talk about the violence that was also inflicted, that was indeed inflicted on young demonstrators? Or would you put it into a big macro context Would you just write about would you write it just as a political narrative? Or would you bring to the surface the voices, the issues, the truths, the ugly truths sometimes, very often, which would not be revealed at all, or which writing and research is an interpretation. We choose what facts we want to talk about. We choose the people we want to interview. So that would be my first point. I'm not quite sure why you put it in conjunction with oral history or history, where there is a time lag. I think when we're talking about, I think what holds for the study of the contemporary period holds as well for the study of the past with a time lag. This question, Agnes Ku's interviews with women who joined the resistance, it's not just expressive of the fact that it was a period of state violence. The MCP itself has never deemed it really necessary to tell the history of the women. The MCP itself, in its own tellings, the Labour Party, many of the political movements have themselves in the history, in the history telling, in the historiography, foregrounded the stories of the great men who have led the parties either to victory or to defeat. So a history from below perspective, or that uses a methodology of oral history, it's a question of perspective as well. It's not just a question, it's a question of perspective and framing and meaning, and not just a question of facts.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the explanation, which I think really answered what I was trying to bring up. I guess the thought that led me to ask about Agnes Ku is about the fact that we are living in a time where a lot of the data can be gathered online because of social media. People write stuff on blogs, people tweet, and so in a sense, I'm just raising the issue of it. In some sense, it's easier to do history now because many people are writing stuff.
Yeah, right. It's a great resource.
but at the same time, it's also very difficult, especially when it's an issue where the state take exception to lah. You know, like in this case now, if I want to write stuff to defend the Bangladeshi who has been deported, you know, for speaking up in the so that's why I tied it maybe a bit convoluted way with maybe some things are safer to be documented later, given that in this moment to write about it, you will face state sanctions. Yeah, but thank you so much for both. Ying Xin.
Thank you, Kiaming. I'm going to go to the last question just because of time. We're a bit 10 minutes. I'm sorry, Ying Xin, do you have any comments to that? Okay,
No,
so
yeah.
there was one last question. Let me just find it. Ban Chan Lian Heng, who asks, why history from below and not Rakyat history? The life exposed of ordinary people, the extraordinary lives of ordinary people. So why history from below and not Rakyat history?
Yeah, I suppose Rakyat history is what we have, what has been translated as people's history. As I said earlier, the different meanings given to different terms. Generally, I suppose it's just taking the easy way out. I would say a people's history from below. There have been different traditions. People's history has been more associated with the history, a historiography which foregrounds mass movements and communities, whereas a history from below a tradition has foregrounded more everyday, ordinary people's lives, and not just political movements, but with a keen eye to how the agency of ordinary people in everyday life situations actually contribute. You can level up to seeing structures of political agency and collective political agency as well. So yeah, it's a matter of terminology, I think. I don't think we can give a definition of either one. I see it more as a matter of perspective rather than of content.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Ying Xin, I'd like to ask you if you can answer that question or any other ones that you'd like to address, and perhaps maybe give a little bit of a summary before we end, and then I'll ask Diana also to do the same.
Okay, yeah, maybe for this one, I just want to add a thought, maybe, because people history is about people, although Diana mentioned that history from below focus on giving people's voice, but I just wonder whether there might be possibility that history from below, it's not only about people, it's not so anthropocentric. It could be about history from things or jobs or, that we have neglected. So we can use the history from below perspective to talk about those those things. Yeah, I think that would be all from me. And yeah, thanks, Lynn and Diana.
Thank you. And Diana, any other thoughts that you'd like to raise as a way to sum up today's conversation?
I just want to say that actually, as a sociologist, I've always envied the literary researchers who can look to works of fiction, of the historical, of the imagination, to explore what we've been talking about, the lives of everyday people, and how the lives, the dreams, the meanings which everyday people, and as Lien Hing said, not just everyday, extraordinary people in the everyday class, or how the meanings that they give can provide much more insight, I think, very often than sociological works into the role of collective agency and the making of collective structures and mentalities. So I think for me, two things I think I've learned from today's discussion. One, actually how much work is being done, how much how much oral history projects, and not just oral history projects, documentation, I mean, films, etc. It's not just oral history into writing. How much there is being done in Malaysia today, but they're all scattered. But I think it testifies, it gives witness to the interest that is there at the ground level among all sorts of people whom we don't know, in trying to make sense of their own history, of their local history, their family history, their community history. And I really think that maybe we should do more to develop this kind of interest and this kind of work. Yeah, and the second thing I learned, because Ying Xin was on the panel, was how much we can learn from works of fiction, Malaysian fiction. And again, it seems to me that there's a lot of work going on there too. We're finally getting good literary material, fiction writers, Malaysian writers, in the various languages that's part of our heritage, of the Malaysian heritage. And I think we shouldn't just be thinking when we think of a history from below perspective, we shouldn't just confine ourselves to an oral history perspective, but to look at all sorts of materials which would provide us access into the issues that we are interested in. in terms of a history from below. Oral history is merely one methodology among many others. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Lynn, can I just add one point to second that point about we have to work together? Because I think Malaysian, we are kind of bounded by language barriers as well.
Yeah,
So
that's right. Absolutely.
yeah, we need people who can speak so many different dialects, language. We have to work together. Instead of just Chinese documenting their Chinese community and Malay, their Malay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's the
Also,
point.
I just want to say, East Malaysia and West Malaysia, we have a very
Yes.
West Malaysian centric discussion, and there's a lot of history making projects that's also happening in East Malaysia and Sabah and Sarawak that be good for us to also learn from as well.
Yeah, and Lynn has been collecting Orang Asli history stories as well.
Right, and Orang Asli. So I've been working with young people actually to document their family history and sort of try to tie into people's history. So I mean, thank you so much, both of you. I think we've had such a great fodder. The discussion has been wonderful. A lot of people have been commenting that they've learned a lot from this discussion. And what we hope to have more of these kinds of webinars. And please, if you have suggestions of people you think would be good for our series, please send me an email, let me know. And we'll try to arrange for these more of these discussions in the future. Thank you again, Diana and Ying Xin. Thank you, Mariam, who's our technical manager today, who's sent emails and messages to everyone. We hope to see you again next month. And next month, we look forward to Fahmi Reza and his work on Hartal, which also came out from both oral history project and a filmmaking project that he engaged in. And in January, we'll have Paul Hyung Hong as well. And I think she wants to focus on methodology in that talk. So thank you again to both the speakers and for everyone who stayed on until 10 and more 10:15. It's been a really fruitful discussion. Thank you and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.